Hi again. So today I'm going to do a similar thing to my last blog and take a term or a couple of terms and sort of pick them apart to kind of attempt to problematize them and with no other agenda other than trying to look for the second narrative in things, trying to question things that we might assume are kind of ideas that are just taken for granted or taken as given. And so the two topics that I want to touch on today are ideas of diversity and tolerance and otherness, which are the sort of buzzwords and important markers of the postmodern world that we live in now. So, without further ado, let's get cracking. So, Slavoj Zizek has quite recently identified one of the many issues with tolerance, diversity, and multiculturalism, and why in certain fields it might not be working. And yes, I can hear the SJW sickles being sharpened from here, but hear me out. Zizek coins the term decaffeinated otherness. Now, Zizek's a funny guy and a self-proclaimed antagonizer, so a certain amount of salt needs to be pinched into his ideas at times. That said, let's take this idea of decaffeinated otherness and run with it. So what Zizek's criticising here is the unthought-through virtue signalling of statements like, we're all the same, there's no race. You see, we can't have diversity as well as this level of complete acceptance of similarity. If we're all the same, if there's no race, then there's no diversity. True? You can't have both. And the same can be claimed in terms of gender, sexuality, class, etc. But there's an increasing trend of people who want a kind of totalism on these ideas, and a hypocritical one at that. So what is decaffeinated otherness? In short, this is the desire for diversity without conflict. We want total acceptance of otherness to the point that the other becomes obliterated. Yet at the same time, we want to cling to diversity. We want the signs of diversity without the divergence of diversity. And with it just being a sign or a performance of diversity, it ends up just being a simulacra and can never be more than that. Diversity and tolerance are by necessity fraught bedfellows. So let's take them in turn and see. So diversity insists upon a smorgasbord of contrasts and differences in the way one looks, speaks, behaves, thinks. And it's only natural that conflict comes from this. Now, not isolated conflict, of course, but nonetheless, conflict is present. So a priest or an imam won't face a crowd of gay, pro-choice Buddhist feminists without at least internal and or unspoken conflict occurring. In the same sense, a liberal won't be able to sit with members of the EDL without at least some spoken, acted or unspoken, unacted clash. Diversity may well be very good in a great many ways, but it's definitely not without ripples, without clash, without conflict. There is no diversity without divergence. These collisions and conflicts are okay though. We just practice tolerance. Cool. So let's just pick this scab a little bit just to make sure that we're not going blind. Tolerance at a core level is about accepting behaviour regardless of its difficulty. It is again fraught. Tolerance requires the same level of differentiation and divergence. It requires otherness. To tolerate is to say, I don't agree, but I allow. And in this, we're keeping the other at a distance, at a safe distance. We're accepting their difference and tolerating it through distancing, muting, blinkering. Tolerance, then, we might argue, is an act of muted intolerance, which is not too far removed from Zizek's idea of the decaffeinated other. Now, another impact this has is one of identity. To what extent do we extend tolerance in the face of intolerance? Can tolerance of one thing act as a negation of self or community? Now, there's been tons of thinkers, writers, philosophers, psychoanalysts who've constructed theories. And yes, I use the term constructed with thorough knowledge of what the implications are in terms of these cultural identity politics and cultural studies notions. But these thinkers have developed theories around our sense of self, our subjectivity, and how it's formed through, at least in part, a recognition of difference. Julia Kristeva, for example, suggests that the subject comes into being through a series of distancing acts that separate the I from the other. Lacan's mirror stage is rooted in the subject's recognition of themselves as separate from the mother, an entity that's cut away. Michel Foucault has laid bare how sense of difference and otherness is fundamental to the regimes of truth that enable self-awareness and negotiation with cultures. Kenneth Burke argued that man is the creator of the negative, and how we understand life through good, bad, right, wrong, straight, gay, black, white dichotomies. So otherness and difference is fundamental to our sense of being, our sense of community. Now, this is a blog, so we don't have time to kind of pick apart all of these theories. But in essence, I want to argue that part of self-identification, our sense of being, is based on the recognition of difference or otherness. For example, I recognise my gender, class, race, sexuality, along with many other markers of my identity, in part by noticing it as different in than others. So in order to maintain a sense of individuality, of being, the acts of separating and recognising difference are linchpins. If we're all the same, then there's no self. If there's no self, then there's no real order. Or, to the worst extent, in the example of Stalinism, we see totalitarian order in the negation of self. So, if we take this to the nth degree, we might all well end up like the pool of perverse flesh fucking and devouring itself at the end of Brian Yuzna's classic body horror Society. So, this is a case for diversity. We can't be without the other. The other upholds the self. It's also a case for clash, collision, divergence. For this too upholds the self, upholds community. Now, I'm not calling for unfettered, unmanaged intolerance, and I'm not seeing intolerance as a potential radical politics. It's just a call to arm ourselves against unthinking on these matters. We cannot get a truly diverse, multicultural system to work without embracing the fact that significant clashes and conflicts are intrinsic to it and necessary to it. Without that embrace, we risk losing our sense of culture, of place, of community, of sexuality, race, gender. And it doesn't matter if we see these things as biological or cultural constructions, the result is the same. We risk the makeup of our identity.